At the end of the Civil War in 1865, the South stood shattered, its economy in ruins, its cities scarred, and its once proud aristocracy humbled. The era of Reconstruction brought not only political upheaval and the challenge of rebuilding, but also a profound social transformation. For the old planter families of Virginia, who had lived for generations on sprawling estates and in a world sustained by enslaved labor, the war's outcome marked the collapse of their social order. No family symbolized this transformation more than the household of General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, whose name had come to embody the ideals, tragedies, and contradictions of the Old South. To many Southerners, the fate of Lee's 7 children was more than a private story. It was a reflection of how an entire generation of the Southern elite confronted loss, adapted to change, and searched for meaning in a nation that had been irreversibly altered. None of Robert E. Lee's 4 daughters ever married, and one of them even faced arrest for refusing to move from the whites-only section of a segregated streetcar, an act of defiance decades before the Civil Rights Movement. His sons pursued paths as varied as soldiering, farming, politics, and education. One became a college president and fought a landmark lawsuit against the U.S. government. Another rebuilt his family line after devastating personal tragedy. Still another turned to writing to preserve the memory of his father. Their lives unfolded at the intersection of personal destiny and national history. The struggles, choices, and sacrifices of the Lee children offer not only a glimpse into the legacy of one of America's most famous families, but also a window into the South itself as it stumbled from the ashes of war into the uncertain dawn of a new century. Number 7. George Washington Custis Lee. Born in 1832, Custis was named for his maternal grandfather, George Washington Parke Custis, and carried the weight of both the Washington and Lee family legacies. He was a serious, studious young man. In fact, he graduated first in his class at West Point in 1854, just as his father had years before. When Virginia seceded, Custis followed in his father's footsteps, resigning his U.S. Army commission to join the Confederacy in 1861. During the Civil War, Custis Lee served mostly in Richmond. He became a Confederate general and was appointed as an aide-de-camp to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, acting as a top military advisor in the capital. In the war's final days, Custis commanded troops during the desperate defense of Petersburg and Richmond. He was even captured at Sailor's Creek just days before his father surrendered at Appomattox. After the war, Custis Lee faced a world very different from the one he was born into. With his father's name and reputation, there were expectations for him to lead. And indeed, he did step up. Custis succeeded his father as president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia in 1871. The college was later renamed Washington and Lee University to honor his father. Custis Lee led the college for 26 years, maintaining the Lee family's connection to the institution and educating a new generation of young men. One of Custis' most dramatic post-war chapters was the fight to regain the family's Arlington estate. In the 1870s, he sued the U.S. government, arguing that Arlington had been taken illegally during the war. In an 1882 landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with Custis Lee, ruling 5-4 in his favor. This victory meant Custis technically regained title to Arlington and the 100 acres around it, including what had become Arlington National Cemetery. Of course, by then, the estate was a sacred burial ground for thousands, so Custis had no intention of evicting the fallen. Instead, he accepted a settlement. In 1883, the U.S. government paid him $150,000, a huge sum at the time, for Arlington House and its grounds. In this way, Custis Lee ensured some compensation for his family's loss, while allowing Arlington to remain the nation's military cemetery. Despite his public roles, Custis Lee was a private, even shy individual. He never married or had children, perhaps in part because the war and its aftermath left him with little to offer a potential bride in the way of home or fortune. In later years, he lived a quiet life, moving in with his younger brother Rooney's family at a country estate called Ravensworth. Custis stayed active in veterans events and as a respected elder of the Lee family. When he passed away in 1913 at the age of 80, it marked the end of an era. He was the last surviving Confederate general from the Lee family, and one of the last links to the world of the antebellum Virginia gentry. Custis Lee was laid to rest with his family at Lexington, having dedicated his life to duty, education, and preserving his father's legacy. Number 6. Mary Custis Lee was born in 1835 and named after her mother. Mary was 25 when the Civil War began, and she shared her parents' steadfast Southern loyalties. However, Mary Custis Lee's own life took a very different trajectory from the traditional path of marriage and domesticity that one might expect of a 19th century Virginia debutante. In fact, Mary grew into an independent and rather unconventional woman. For her time, one who ultimately spent much of her life abroad, far from her family's Virginia home. During the war, Mary and her sisters did what many Southern ladies of their class did. They volunteered in hospitals, sewed socks and gloves for Confederate soldiers, and endured the hardships of displacement. Mary was with her mother in Richmond for most of the conflict, as they could not return to Arlington. When the war ended and her father became president of Washington College, Mary lived with her parents for a while in Lexington, Virginia. But she was restless and headstrong. She had inherited her mother's Custis fortune. And once the federal government paid the settlement for Arlington, Mary suddenly had significant personal funds at her disposal. Starting in the 1870s, Mary Custis Lee did something quite daring for a woman of her era. She became a world traveler. She remained single and felt little need to conform to others' expectations. Using her inheritance from the sale of Arlington, Mary embarked on extensive journeys across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. She visited England, even scoring an audience with Queen Victoria, met Pope Leo XIII in Rome, toured the Holy Land, and explored far-flung places like Egypt, India, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, China, Japan, and Australia. Mary loved adventure and apparently enjoyed the celebrity that came with being General Lee's daughter. Her famous name opened doors to high society around the globe. Mary's independent streak also showed itself in smaller ways. In 1902, while back in Virginia, the 67-year-old Mary Custis Lee got arrested in an incident that caused quite a stir. The charge: she refused to move out of the whites-only section of a segregated streetcar in Alexandria, choosing to sit with her African-American maid instead. This was decades before Rosa Parks. Jim Crow laws were in effect, and Mary's defiance was highly unusual for a person of her background. The arrest was controversial and even used by some as an argument for desegregation, though historians still debate Mary's intentions. Was she making a civil rights stand, or just stubbornly resisting anyone telling her where she could sit? Either way, it added to her reputation as an eccentric. After the streetcar episode, Mary seemingly shrugged it off and hopped back on a ship to Europe, preferring the more permissive atmosphere abroad. Mary Custis Lee never married. By all accounts, she valued her freedom and perhaps felt that marriage would be a trap for her independent spirit. She also spent long periods arranged or apart from her family. In fact, Mary did not even attend the funerals of her own sisters or her parents, often being overseas when they passed. This aloofness earned her a bit of a reputation as the most insensitive of the Lee's siblings, at least in the eyes of her more dutiful sister Mildred, who once bitterly remarked how Mary left them to bear our sorrow alone. Yet, Mary was who she was, an unapologetic free spirit. In November 1918, as World War I was coming to a close, Mary Custis Lee died at age 83 at a resort in Hot Springs, Virginia. Remarkably, she lived long enough to see the world her father knew transform into the modern 20th century. She witnessed the United States reunified and even fighting alongside its former enemies overseas. Mary was the last surviving child of Robert E. Lee. With her death in 1918, an entire generation, the direct offspring of the famous general, passed into history. Number 5. William Henry Fitzhugh Rooney Lee. Born in 1837 at Arlington, Rooney inherited a double dose of distinguished Virginia blood. He was named after his maternal grandmother's family, the Fitzhughs, and he counted Liger Harry Lee, Revolutionary War hero and Robert's father, among his ancestors. But despite the lofty family tree, Rooney Lee was known to be easygoing, fun-loving, and one of the most likable of the Lee children. As a boy, he was so tall and lively that his father joked Rooney was too large to be a man, too small to be a horse, and might need a tight rein to keep him in line. In the 1850s, young Rooney had a taste of Northern life. He attended Harvard University for a time and became popular in Boston society. But academia did not hold his interest. By 1857, with help from General Winfield Scott, Rooney secured a commission in the U.S. Army and saw action in the West. He joined the campaign against the Mormons in Utah. Soon bored with peacetime army life, he resigned in 1859 and settled down to what he thought would be the life of a gentleman farmer. He married Charlotte Wickham that year, and his grandfather George Custis gifted him the White House plantation on the Pam River in Virginia. Yes, it was really called White House, and it had been Martha Washington's property, part of Mary Custis Lee's inheritance. Then came the Civil War. Rooney, like his brothers, joined the Confederate Army in 1861. He became a cavalry officer under General J. Ebb Stuart and quickly proved himself a brave and capable leader. He led the 9th Virginia Cavalry, and by 1863 rose to the rank of Major General. General Rooney Lee had a notably eventful war service. He fought in many battles under his father's command in the Army of Northern Virginia. In June 1863, just weeks before Gettysburg, Rooney was wounded in a cavalry fight at Brandy Station. While recovering at his wife's family home, he was captured by Union forces. The Federals shipped him to a prison in New York, where Rooney spent about 8 months as a P, before being exchanged in early 1864. He returned to Confederate service in time for the Petersburg siege. Tragically, the war devastated Rooney's young family. His wife Charlotte died in 1863 while he was imprisoned, and their 2 little children also died of illness during the war. One of his sons, Rob, named after his grandfather, died of typhoid fever as a toddler when Union troops burned down White House plantation in 1862. By war's end, Rooney Lee had lost his home, his wife, and all his children. It was an immense personal blow, one that his father, General Lee, surely grieved with him. After the Confederacy's collapse, Rooney was paroled and went back to what he knew, plantation life. He returned to the rebuilt White House estate and resumed farming. In 1867, Rooney found happiness again. He remarried, wedding a Virginia woman named Mary Tabb Bowling. Together they had several children and rebuilt the Lee family line. Rooney's and Rob's offspring would eventually give Robert E. Lee over 20 direct descendants in later generations. It's said that Rooney continued the genteel traditions he remembered from Arlington. Evening tea prayers at bedtime, Sunday hymns, keeping alive the domestic rhythms his mother had instilled. Rooney didn't stay out of the public eye, though. He became active in local affairs and entered politics during Reconstruction, an era when many ex-Confederates were barred from office at first, but later regained influence. By the 1880s, William Rooney Lee served as a Democratic congressman from Virginia, representing the 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's a striking fact. Less than 25 years after fighting against the United States, Robert E. Lee's son took an oath to the U.S. Constitution and served in the same Capitol that Union soldiers had died to defend. Rooney was a moderate, respected voice for Virginia's recovering post-war economy. He held that office from 1887 until his death. In the autumn of 1891, Rooney Lee died at age 54 after an illness. At the time of his death, he was still a sitting congressman. Rooney was buried in Lexington in the Lee family crypt, not far from the remains of his famed father. Of all the Lee children, Rooney perhaps best balanced a return to normalcy with public service. He had answered the call to battle, suffered grievous losses, but managed to start anew, leaving a legacy through his children who ensured the Lee name lived on and his contributions in Congress. To his father's old soldiers, Rooney was one of their own. To the next generation of Virginians, he was a link between the Old South and the New South, utterly, and yet in some ways, not at all. Number 4, Anne Carter Lee. Born in June 1839, Annie was known for her sweet, gentle nature. Her father affectionately called her "my gentle Annie." She was a fun-loving, warm presence in the family, often joking and pulling pranks with a self-deprecating sense of humor. Annie was also very close to her younger sister, Agnes. The two were just 2 years apart and inseparable. So much so that relatives referred to them as the girls, or like twin roses on one stem. Before the war, Annie and Agnes did everything together, shared a bedroom, shared toys, and supported each other through the ups and downs of boarding school and childhood illnesses. Annie had a special role in the family as well. When their mother's rheumatoid arthritis worsened in the late 1850s, Annie took on managing the household and even helped educate her little sister Mildred. she had a kind heart. In defiance of Virginia law, young Annie quietly taught enslaved children at Arlington how to read and write, showing a sense of responsibility and compassion beyond her years. When war broke out, 21-year-old Annie's life was thrown into turmoil like the rest of the family. She and Agnes went to stay at a relative's plantation, Ravensworth, for safety, and even helped hide some of the family's precious belongings, like silver heirlooms and portraits from Union troops. By 1862, with Arlington lost, Annie joined her mother and the other girls at a friend's home in North Carolina to wait out the conflict. Tragically, Annie fell ill with typhoid fever in August 1862. Despite hopes that a change of climate would help, Annie's condition worsened. Agnes and their mother Mary desperately nursed her in a cottage at White Sulphur Springs, North Carolina. Agnes never left her bedside. At one point, she even crawled into bed to keep Annie warm when she was shivering with fever. On October 20th, 1862, Annie Lee died just 23 years old. Her final words were a soft call for her sister. Where's Agnes, illustrating the deep bond between the two young women. The loss of Annie was a devastating emotional blow to the Lees. Far away in Virginia, General Lee broke down and wept upon reading the news of his daughter's death. He wrote to his wife, "To know that I shall never see her again on earth is agonizing in the extreme." A rare glimpse of the grief behind the stoic general's image. Agnes, for her part, was inconsolable. She had lost not just a sister, but her best friend. It made her quiet, her family noted later. Part of Agnes seemed to die with Annie. Because the war was raging, the family could not easily bring Annie's body back to Virginia. She was buried in North Carolina, in a small grave on the plantation where she died. Locals there kindly erected a small obelisk memorial for Miss Annie a few years later. It wasn't until 1869, after the war, that Robert E. Lee and Agnes were able to visit Annie's grave and thank the town's people for caring for it. Number 3. Eleanor Agnes Lee, born in 1841, was the 5th child of Robert and Mary Lee and the 3rd daughter, where her sister Annie was remembered as playful and light-hearted. Agnes was known for her piety, her quiet strength, and her reflective intellect. Family members often described her as gentle, yet serious, with an air of calm that contrasted her sister's lively humor. As a young girl, Agnes became the family's unofficial chronicler. For 5 years, she kept a detailed diary recording everything from skating on the frozen canal to birthday celebrations for George Washington at Arlington House. She also described visits from important guests such as author Washington Irving, offering modern historians invaluable glimpses into the intimate domestic life of the Lee family. Her writings brim with youthful observation, curiosity, and affection. In one entry, she wrote of the beauty of Arlington's gardens. "The roses bloom as if they know no sorrow, yet I feel the shadows of history around us." In another, she captured her childlike joy, skated on the canal today. "The air so crisp I could have flown." These fragments remain a window into the world she once knew, a world that would soon vanish forever. Agnes was deeply bound to her sister Annie. The two were so close in age and affection that family called them the girls, likening them to twin roses on a single stem. When Annie fell ill with typhoid fever in 1862, Agnes nursed her with desperate devotion, crawling into bed to keep her shivering sister warm. When Annie died in October of that year, just 23 years old, Agnes was shattered. She was only 21 herself, and the loss of her dearest companion left a wound that would never fully heal. That same year, around Christmas, Agnes faced another chapter of heartbreak. At Hickory Hill, the Virginia estate of her brother Rooney's in-laws, she was visited by her distant cousin and close childhood friend, Orton Williams. The two had long shared an affectionate bond, and it was widely believed they were in love. Family members whispered that Orton wished to propose, and that Agnes, already stricken with grief over Annie, hesitated. Perhaps she feared losing yet another person she held dear. Perhaps he never asked at all. What is certain is that just 6 months later, in June 1863, Orton was arrested by Union forces and executed as a spy. The brutal suddenness of his death left Agnes bereft. In the space of a single year, she had lost her sister and the man she may have loved. Those who knew her said she was never the same again. The vibrant girl who once filled her diary with playful details grew quieter, more reserved, as though her heart had dimmed. Still, Agnes persevered with dignity. After the Confederate surrender in 1865, the Lee family reunited in Richmond. Almost immediately, Agnes herself fell ill with typhoid fever, the same disease that had claimed Annie. This time, she survived thanks in part to the care of her mother and younger sister, Mildred. Frail but alive, she moved with her family to Lexington when her father became president of Washington College. There she became a graceful presence in the small community, admired for her kindness and modesty. Though she attracted suitors, including a professor from the Virginia Military Institute, Agnes never married. The combination of personal tragedy and her own religious temperament seemed to set her on a different course. She poured her energy into her family and her faith, helping her mother manage social obligations and supporting her father in his later years. Religion became her anchor. She prayed daily, attended services with devotion, and often spoke of the comfort she found in surrendering her sorrows to God. Friends remembered her as serene with a quiet, almost monastic strength, as if her grief had turned her gaze permanently heavenward. When Robert E. Lee died in 1870, it was Agnes who took on the somber duty of preparing his body, dressing him in the suit he had worn at Rooney's wedding. Her mother, overcome with grief, was unable to face the task. For Agnes, it was both an act of service and a reopening of her old wounds. Burying her father brought back the raw pain of burying Annie. By 1873, her health began to decline. Sources differ on the illness. Some say typhoid fever returned, others cholera, but all agree she grew gravely ill. On October 12th of that year, the third anniversary of her father's death, Mildred noted her sister's tired eyes and fading spirit. Days later, weak and fading, Agnes whispered to her elder brother Custis, "You must not forget me when I am gone." Custis, in tears, assured her that none of them ever could. On October 15th, 1873, Agnes died at the age of 32, 3 years and 3 days after her father, almost as if her heart had waited only that long to follow him. Her death was followed swiftly by that of her mother, Mary Custis Lee. Just 3 weeks later, the grief too much for her failing health. Agnes was laid to rest in the Lee Chapel in Lexington. Beside her father, her short life remembered for its deep faith, tragic losses, and enduring devotion. Like her sisters, Agnes never married and left no descendants. Yet through her diary, her letters, and the memory of her quiet resilience, she left behind a legacy of remembrance. She was the family's memory keeper, the dutiful daughter, and the grieving sister. In her story of love, lost faith, endured, and sorrow born with grace, one can glimpse the essence of the Lee family's struggles and the broader fate of the South itself, wounded, dignified, and forever marked by loss. Number two, Robert E. Lee Jr., known as Rob or Bob to family, was the youngest son of the Lee clan. The baby boy born in 1843, he was just 18 when the Civil War began, still a student at the University of Virginia. Initially, his mother tried to dissuade him from joining the army. She had already sent husband Robert and sons Custis and Rooney off to war and dreaded seeing her youngest son go as well. But by 1862, as the conflict intensified, Rob could not resist the call to serve. He enlisted as a private in the Rockbridge Artillery and later became an aide-de-camp to his elder brother, General Rooney Lee, in the cavalry. Rob was promoted to captain before war's end. There's a poignant story from the Battle of Sharpsburg Antietam in 1862. Young Rob Manning, a Confederate artillery battery, didn't even realize his father was nearby until General Lee rode up to his unit, covered in gunpowder grime. Rob expected some fatherly acknowledgement, but Lee didn't recognize his own son at first glance. Only when Rob spoke did the general realize, and even then Lee simply gave a soldierly order. "Yes, my son. Do what you can to drive those people back." It was a brief stoic interaction in the midst of chaos, illustrating the curious dynamic of being both a son and a subordinate to the great Robert E. Lee. Rob Lee served until the very end of the war. In fact, he gave his family quite a scare in April 1865, during the retreat from Petersburg. His horse was shot from under him, and he became separated from the army. For almost a month, the Lee had no idea what had happened to Robbie. By the time he got a new mount, Union forces had cut off his route to rejoin General Lee. Rob headed south and coincidentally was present in Greensboro, North Carolina, when President Jefferson Davis received word that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. So Robert Jr. technically missed Appomattox, but he soon turned himself in and was periled. All three of General Lee's sons survived the war, something his wife would later say was a blessing amid so much loss. After 1865, Rob tried his hand at what he truly loved, being a farmer. Like Rooney, he had inherited one of his grandfather Custis's properties, Roman Coke Plantation in King William County on the Pomey River. This was just across the river from Rooney's White House estate. The two brothers lived as neighbors, cultivating the land in that difficult Reconstruction era, when enslaved labor was gone and fortunes were hard to rebuild. Rob never achieved great wealth, but he was a hands-on planter and managed to make a life on the soil. People who knew him described Rob as the most humble and unassuming of the Lee children. He didn't seek public office or limelight. Rob did, however, find love. In 1871, at age 27, he married Charlotte Hacksaw, a young Richmond belle. Sadly, tragedy struck early. Charlotte died just a few months into the marriage in 1872. One account says of complications from a miscarriage. It was a brief union, and Rob was widowed with no children from that marriage. Many years later, in 1894, he remarried wedding Juliet Carter, with whom he finally started a family. Rob had two daughters, whom he named Anne Carter Lee, after his lost sister, and Mary Custis Lee, after his mother and sister. By giving his girls those names, Rob poignantly honored the memory of the Lee women who meant so much to him. Perhaps Robert Jr.'s most significant contribution to history was as an author and guardian of his father's legacy. He was a natural storyteller, known for his warm reminiscences. In 1904, Rob published Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, a book compiling his personal memories and many of his father's private letters. This work provided invaluable insight into day-to-day life at Arlington and his father's character from the perspective of a loving son. It's thanks to Rob's effort that we have intimate details of General Lee, from his habits to his correspondence, that otherwise might have been lost to time. The book was well received and still serves as a key primary source for historians studying Robert E. Lee's personal life. Robert E. Lee Jr. lived to see the 20th century and the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. He stayed out of the political fray, focusing on his family and writing. On October 19, 1914, Rob died in Virginia at the age of 70. By then, he was one of the last surviving children of Robert E. Lee. Only his elder sister Mary was still alive 4 more years. Rob was buried in Lexington with his parents and siblings, through Rob's 2 daughters and Rooney's children. The Lee bloodline continued, and indeed, through Rooney and Rob, over 20 direct descendants of Mary and Robert E. Lee were alive by the 21st century. Thus, unlike many of his sisters, Rob helped ensure that the family tree kept growing. Number 1. Born in 1846. Mildred Childe Lee was 16 years younger than her eldest sibling Custis, and her arrival late in her parents' lives was greeted with joy. She was affectionately nicknamed Precious Life, later shortened simply to Life. The 7th and final child of Robert and Mary Lee, Mildred would go on to live the longest life of all her sisters, spending the majority of it in the post-war era unmarried, devoted to family and remembered as a gentle, steadfast figure in the Lee household. When the Civil War began, Mildred was away at boarding school in North Carolina. By the time she was 17, the conflict had disrupted her education, and she returned home to Richmond to live with her mother and sisters. Like so many Southern women of her generation, Mildred threw herself into the Confederate cause. She knitted socks for soldiers, making sure her father's army had warm clothing, and even volunteered in hospitals, caring for the wounded. Her personality, however, was not defined solely by duty. There is a charming, often retold anecdote about a mischievous wild squirrel that Mildred attempted to domesticate in Richmond. The little creature bit visitors, scampered through the house, and generally wreaked havoc until it disappeared altogether, leaving Mildred saddened by the loss. That light-hearted episode captures her gentle, slightly quirky nature, standing in stark contrast to the grim backdrop of war. In April 1865, Mildred was with her mother and sisters when Richmond fell and burned around them. Union General Godfrey Weitzel offered them safe passage. But the Lee women refused to abandon their home, watching the flames draw close and then subside just a block away. After Appomattox, when Robert E. Lee rejoined his family in Richmond, Mildred grew especially close to her father. In Lexington, where the family later settled, she became his frequent walking companion. Each evening, father and daughter could be seen strolling together, sharing quiet conversations. Lee teased Mildred about her terrible handwriting, her poor cooking, and her ever-present cloud of cats, but always with affection. These tender moments revealed a softer side of the general, who found comfort in the company of his youngest daughter. During Lee's final illness in 1870, Mildred sat by his bedside during the day, while her sister Agnes kept watch at night, rubbing his hands to keep them warm as the autumn rain fell outside. It was a touching reversal. The little girl he had once worried about for playing in the sun without her bonnet was now the woman tending him in his last hours. After his death, Mildred's role became even more vital. With her mother an invalid and Agnes's death soon after, Mildred assumed responsibility for the household, caring for Mary Custis Lee until her passing later in 1873. At just 27, Mildred and her older sister Mary were the last two Lee daughters left, and their relationship was often strained. Mildred yearned for closeness, but Mary's frequent travels created distance between them, leaving Mildred feeling abandoned with the family burdens. Though she had suitors, Mildred never married. Her devotion to her father made every potential match pale in comparison. "To me, he seems a hero, and all other men small in comparison," she once confessed. That reverence made it clear why no man ever won her hand. Instead, Mildred found her place as a companion to her brothers, sometimes acting as hostess at Washington College for Custis, who never married, or visiting Rob at Romancoke. Faith and charity filled much of her later years. She was active in her church, often organizing charity bazaars and fundraisers for Confederate veterans and widows. Like her sister Mary, she eventually traveled abroad, attending Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, touring France and marveling at the pyramids of Egypt. Yet she remained modest about her own life. When asked about writing her biography, she demurred, saying that the true history of my life would read stranger, sadder, more inexplicable than any romance. By the 1890s, Mildred and Mary reunited on occasion, standing side by side at the unveilings of their father's monuments in New Orleans and Richmond. They were also present for their brother Rooney's final days, a reminder that in moments of loss, the siblings came together despite differences. By the turn of the century, Mildred's health was failing, likely due to the lingering effects of typhoid she had suffered years earlier. In March 1905, while visiting New Orleans during Mardi Gras, she suffered a stroke and died on March 27th at the age of 59. Her death was widely mourned across the South. Flags were flown at half-staff, and many saw in her passing the extinguishing of the last gentle flame of Robert E. Lee's daughters. Confederate veterans and Washington and Lee alumni escorted her coffin by train back to Lexington, where she was laid to rest in the Lee Chapel crypt beside her parents and her sister Agnes. In life, Mildred had been the light-bearer of her family, the devoted daughter who comforted her father, the loyal caretaker who held the household together, and the quiet soul who preserved dignity in the face of sorrow. In death, she became a symbolic final chapter of her generation, remembered as the last candle of the Lee daughters, whose flickering light carried the memory of the Old South into the new century. With Mildred's death, the curtain fell on the generation of Lee's immediate children. She had been the heart of the post-war Lee family, the one who stayed when others left, and the one who kept alive the memory of Mars Robert in the home. Mildred's life might not have been filled with the dramatic accomplishments of her brothers, but in her gentle, steadfast way, she preserved the dignity and warmth of the Lee legacy into the 20th century. Okay,